Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Friday, everybody. There will be no video tomorrow, but there will be a makeup video on Sunday. Yesterday, during a Moscow business forum, Russian leader Vladimir Putin announced that he plans to visit China in May, without elaborating. This will come after Xi Jinping is expected to visit the EU, and as we have seen, and as we will see shortly in today's video, Europe appears to be at a turning point in their tensions with the PRC. Putin also made the announcement as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visits Beijing this week, in part to warn Beijing against supporting Russia's war industrial base. The same day, yesterday, the NATO Secretary General said China must stop supporting Russia's war in Ukraine if it wants to enjoy good relations with the West, warning it cannot have it both ways. In a speech in Berlin, the alliance chief expressed, quote, "Last year, Russia imported 90% of its microelectronics from China, used to produce missiles, tanks and aircraft. China is also working to provide Russia with improved satellite capabilities and imaging. China says it wants good relations with the West. At the same time, Beijing continues to fuel the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. They cannot have it both ways." End quote. He later added, quote, "In the past, we made the mistake of becoming dependent on Russian oil and gas. We must not repeat that mistake with China. Depending on its money, its raw materials, its technology, dependencies make us vulnerable." End quote. Yesterday, UK-based Reuters reports that China is providing moorage for a US-sanctioned Russian cargo ship implicated in North Korean arms transfers to Russia. According to satellite images obtained by the outlet, Britain's Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a think tank, said that the Russian vessel Angara, which since August 2023 has moved to Russian ports thousands of containers believed to contain North Korean munitions, has been anchored at a Chinese shipyard in eastern Zhejiang province since February. A theme which we have seen emerge in recent weeks on China Update is the European view that Beijing and Moscow are now part of the same axis, and trade and security tensions, previously separated, are now being blended. Indeed, Europe is moving closer to alignment with the US on China policy. In an interview this week, the US ambassador to NATO expressed, quote, "The PRC cannot claim to be entirely neutral in this case, and they are in fact picking a side. I think when the PRC tries to portray itself as neutral, when it comes to this war, we don't buy it." End quote. For our next part, we move then to EU-China tensions. As we know, a lot has happened in this space this week. Trade probes, forced labour product restrictions, multiple spy arrests, raids and accusations of supporting Russia's war. Let's continue to follow the fallout from these developments. Tuesday's raid on PRC firm Nuktek, which we covered earlier this week, quote, "sent shockwaves through the EU." End quote, in the words of Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post, which explained that they suggest that the European Commission, quote, "has moved to a new stage in cracking down on what it views as the biggest risk to the Eurozone economy, foreign subsidies from Beijing, which it believes are causing industrial overcapacity that could see Europe flooded with cheap Chinese imports." End quote. On Wednesday, Chinese businessmen in Europe were still reeling from the raids, the outlet explains, which stunned even the competition lawyers advising these companies. One managing partner at a Brussels law firm told the outlet, quote, "This action surprised even me. A dawn raid in Europe to find out more information about subsidies granted in China makes no sense." End quote. Nuktek, the Chinese security equipment supplier raided by the EU authorities this week, was headed for a time by former President Hu Jintao's son, and had won more than 160 public tenders in Europe over the past decade, despite national security warnings about the company's products. UK-based The Financial Times reports that this Chinese state-owned company produces cargo, baggage and human scanners that are deployed all across Europe, from border checkpoints to the continent's biggest seaports, handling tens of millions of containers each year. Quote, Nuktek has long been criticized for its close links to Beijing and has been red-flagged by the US over potential risks to national security. End quote. The US State Department says that as of 2020, the company had amassed a 90% share of Europe's sea cargo screening equipment market and held up to 50% of the market for airport passenger baggage and cargo screening. Nuktek disputes these figures, however, saying it has about 70% of the cargo screening business and about 10% of the airport market. Meanwhile, even though EU investigations into alleged unfair subsidies for Chinese electric vehicles is still ongoing, on Wednesday evening, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who is now campaigning for re-election, signalled that EU punitive tariffs are likely, expressing, quote, "We like fair competition. What we don't like is when China floods the market with massively subsidized e-cars. We are taking action against this." End quote. US-based Politico explains that the fact that she is addressing the controversial car tariffs so clearly in her election campaign, quote, is likely to increase speculation that the EU investigation will be completed before the European election in June, and that the tariffs will come soon. End quote. And finally, for EU-China, yesterday the former chairperson of the Belgian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee in Federal Parliament, Els van Hoof, said in an interview that Chinese spies had hacked her laptop, the latest incident involving allegations of Chinese spying in Europe, a theme which we have explored in depth in the last two videos. Next up, we discuss the story of China's housing bubble. If you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, I have a huge favor to ask, that is to like and subscribe. Only 45% of regular viewers are subscribed. Liking and subscribing is the only way in which the channel can grow. It's a big help for the algorithm. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. I rely primarily on your support. There is only one sponsored video per month to ensure that the support is primarily from subscribers, and this is a big help as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, we move to the property crisis. This week, US-based The Wall Street Journal published a long-form piece on this called "The Folly of China's Real Estate Boom Was Easy to See, but no one wanted to stop it." The piece is excellent, and the entire thing is worth reading. Here, let us just examine some selected excerpts from the long piece, which we're now quoting directly. That was 2016, during the heady days when the Chinese property boom was just getting going. Even then, the truth was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The boom had turned into a bubble, and was likely to end very badly. The bubble proceeded to get even worse, though, because no one wanted the music to stop. Chinese developers, homebuyers, real estate agents, and even Wall Street banks that helped underwrite the boom all ignored warning signs. Developers found ways to obscure the amount of debt they were holding with the help of bankers and lawyers. Buyers who suspected the property markets were overbuilt bought more anyway. Chinese and foreign investors seeking juicy returns flooded developers with funding. The cheerleaders were operating on a seemingly bulletproof assumption that China's government would never allow the market to crash. Chinese people had invested the majority of their wealth into housing. Letting the market tumble could wipe out much of the population's savings and erode confidence in the Communist Party. Now China is paying the price for failing to act earlier to rein it all in. More than 50 Chinese developers have defaulted on their international debt. Around 500,000 people have lost their jobs, according to Kuyan, a private think tank focused on Chinese property. Some 20 million housing units across China have been left unfinished, and an estimated $440 billion is needed to complete them. Prices for second-hand homes in major cities fell 5.9% in March. Local governments deprived of income from selling land to developers are struggling to service their debts. The overall economy is fragile as real estate and related industries, which once accounted for around 25% of gross domestic product, become the bigger drag on growth. Developers needed a lot of capital, which meant fees for financiers willing to raise it. From 2017 to 2021, Chinese real estate developers raised $258 billion by selling dollar-denominated bonds, according to data provider Dealogic. Banks, including Wall Street heavyweights such as Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, collected $1.72 billion for underwriting these deals. Bankers met to discuss deals in the lobby of the Hong Kong Four Seasons Hotel. One hedge fund manager recalled attending parties at least once a month on yachts owned by Chinese developers, with champagne and female escorts. Chinese banks and international institutions such as Investico, BlackRock, and PIMCO invested in Chinese property bonds. Demand for the bonds, which yielded double-digit returns, far exceeded supply, so investors appeared willing to tolerate dubious deal structures. Evergrande, having become China's biggest development, set its sights on becoming one of the world's top 100 companies by 2020. One executive at a Chinese ratings agency said Evergrande asked him to award the company a sovereign credit rating, which would signal Evergrande was as safe as the Chinese government. 3 large Chinese domestic companies awarded it AAA ratings, the highest possible. S&P Global gave Evergrande only a B+ rating, junk bond territory. Chinese state media highlighted the discrepancy, with People's Daily writing that it was partly due to a lack of understanding of Chinese companies. People's Daily blamed Western firms for exaggerating the potential risks of the Chinese economy and companies. At its height, the total value of Chinese homes and developers' inventory hit $52 trillion, according to Goldman Sachs, twice the size of the US residential market and bigger than the entire US bond market. Chinese people had nearly 78% of their wealth tied up in residential property, compared with 35% in the US. By late 2020, it was becoming harder to ignore the warning signs. Prices in Tianjin were comparable with the most expensive parts of London. Millions of units across China sat empty. On the first day of 2021, regulators imposed a policy known as the 3 Red Lines, which restricted new borrowing by over-leveraged developers. Banks started demanding early loan repayments. Investors stopped buying developers' bonds. Within months, Evergrande was unable to pay suppliers of building materials and construction services. In August 2021, it stopped construction at hundreds of projects. It sought government help later that year, but did not get a bailout. Chinese home buyers, spooked by the possibility that developers might run out of money and leave their homes unfinished, stopped buying. At China's biggest 100 developers, sales nosedived. High-yield bond issuance by Chinese developers fell from $23 billion in 2021 to $431 million in 2022. Developers fell into liquidity crises like dominoes. In December 2021, Evergrande defaulted on its international bonds. In January 2024, a Hong Kong court ordered Evergrande to liquidate, and trading in its shares was suspended at 2 cents apiece. In March, the Chinese securities regulator said that Evergrande overstated its sales in 2019 and 2022 by a total of $78.4 billion, making it the largest ever alleged financial fraud. Here ends the direct quote. My apologies, I've had to change rooms. There was some noise next to my office where I was recording. Like I said, here ends the direct quote of the long piece, which is well worth a read. The piece tells a story of China's property bubble well, but there is one more aspect which needs to be unpacked, about the systemic factors at work. And to do this, we turn to an often quoted expert. In a previously published piece on this theme, Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis explains, quote, "The bubble was not the consequence of greed, stupidity, or an unwillingness to face facts. That's not what drives the late stages of a bubble. What really drives it is a Minskian process in which all balance sheets are locked into supporting the bubble. After many years of rising prices, in other words, businesses, banks, developers, households, and even local governments are forced to lock excessive property-related risk-taking into the structure of their operations and balance sheets. There are always businesses that take on more risk and those that take less risk. But when prices rise rapidly for over 3 decades, the latter gain market share at the expense of the former. So, all businesses eventually must incorporate risky behavior into their operations. The same is true for banks, households, property developers, and local governments. All participants, even the most cautious, are effectively forced to keep betting on rising prices, or they will have been squeezed out of the system years ago. That is why bubbles have huge systemic impacts when they inflate, and even more when they deflate. They force the entire economic system to change its behavior in ways that automatically reinforce the direction of prices, both on the way up and on the way down. What is more, the longer they go on, the greater the consequent damage their deflation is likely to cause, and the harder the regulators work to prevent any reversal of the bubble. This may be why they go on for so long." End quote. That is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Friday, and I will see you all on Sunday.